February 1943, U.S. 2 Corps Sector, near Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. The aid station was set inside a captured farm storage building because it had thick stone walls and a roof that did not collapse under shell vibration. The doors had been removed after the first day to allow stretchers to pass without obstruction. Sandbags lined the interior corners. Lanterns hung from nails hammered into wooden beams blackened by smoke from earlier fighting. The wounded were brought in steadily, not in waves. That detail mattered to the surgeons. Major Robert Hale, regimental surgeon, had served in the Army since before the war and previously worked as a civilian hospital physician in Ohio. He was not inexperienced, and he did not panic easily. He had seen heavy casualties in the first months after American forces entered combat in North Africa and had already adjusted his expectations downward. Still, the numbers from the previous night forced him to sit at the desk longer than usual before writing the morning summary. The injuries were not catastrophic. Shrapnel to limbs, penetrating wounds that avoided major arteries, concussions, moderate blood loss. Yet 6 men had died after arrival. They had spoken, requested water, and responded to orders when first examined. They were not surgical emergencies. They had been placed in the delayed treatment section, a category intended for patients expected to survive until proper surgical care. Hale reviewed each tag again before signing the casualty report. He checked the time of injury, time of arrival, and time of death. The intervals were consistent. Several hours passed between admission and deterioration. Shock developed late, not immediately. He considered dehydration, infection, and exposure. None matched the progression. The temperature during the night had been cold but survivable. Plasma had been administered where indicated. No procedure had been rushed. He did not accuse his own staff, but the possibility remained. Either triage had been incorrect or something outside the aid station was affecting the men before they arrived. He forwarded the report to division headquarters with a note requesting review of evacuation timing. Captain Daniel Mercer was not part of the regiment. He belonged to the medical department statistical section attached temporarily to 2 Corps headquarters. Before the war, he had been a graduate student in public health and had entered service as an administrative officer rather than a practicing physician. He had spent the last year compiling disease incidence reports in training camps, tracking pneumonia outbreaks and sanitation failures. Combat casualty analysis was new to him. He was assigned a file because it contained a discrepancy rather than a complaint. Headquarters staff officers preferred complaints. They could be answered and closed. Discrepancies required comparison across units, and few officers had the time to do it. Mercer's orders were limited. Verify whether the mortality rate exceeded expected norms and determine if documentation errors existed. He was not asked to inspect treatment methods. The regimental command post operated from a half-damaged administrative building previously used by French colonial authorities. Windows were sandbagged from the inside, allowing narrow slits of light. Radios operated continuously in one room, typewriters in another. Mercer arrived during late afternoon while units reorganized after the engagement. Officers were tired but functioning. No one considered the casualty figures unusual because the fighting had been disorganized and confused. Hale met him outside the aid station. His uniform sleeves were rolled and stained, but his tone remained controlled. He did not argue that the deaths were avoidable. He stated only that they were inconsistent. Inside, Mercer examined the triage logs. Each entry included the same handwriting and standard field medical terminology. No alterations were visible. The treatment steps matched doctrine exactly. The key difference appeared in transport time. Some wounded arrived within 40 minutes of injury. Others arrived after 3 to 5 hours despite originating from comparable distances on the map. Terrain alone did not explain the gap. Mercer requested battalion movement reports. In division records, he found another unit that had fought on the same day along a neighboring ridge line. Their wounded had been moved using supply trucks after radio communication with the rear had failed temporarily. The action violated procedure, but was documented because the battalion commander had submitted a written explanation anticipating disciplinary review. Their casualties showed fewer delayed deaths. Mercer checked twice before copying the figures. He did not yet assume meaning. He assumed recording variation. He compared medical tags, similar wound categories, similar ages, similar treatment classifications. The only consistent difference was the time between injury and arrival at surgical facilities. At the evening staff briefing, Mercer presented the discrepancy to the division adjutant for clarification. The response was immediate and firm. The comparison was considered invalid because unauthorized transport altered triage sequence. The trucks may have delivered more severe cases first, distorting the apparent outcome. Additionally, dust inhalation and movement during transport could not be standardized across units. Mercer was instructed to annotate the report as an irregularity and close the inquiry unless evidence of negligence appeared. No accusation had been made, yet the room reacted defensively. He noted that reaction carefully. It indicated the issue touched doctrine rather than performance. Later that night, a chaplain's office forwarded burial documentation requiring administrative confirmation of identity tags. Mercer signed routinely until he noticed identical times of death clustered hours after surgical admission. He returned to the aid station to confirm. Hale showed him the final observation notes: pulse weakening gradually, mental confusion increasing, then collapse without new bleeding. The men had not died on the battlefield. They had died after reaching safety. Neither officer suggested a cause. Both understood that identifying one prematurely would end the inquiry before it began. Mercer closed his notebook without comment. His responsibility was only to determine whether records were accurate. At that moment, he believed they were, and that accuracy created a larger problem than error would have. Outside, artillery continued intermittently along the ridge. Inside the building, the lanterns remained lit because more wounded were expected before dawn. The investigation formally existed now, though no one had announced it. The next morning began before sunrise because the airstrip was active at first light. A transport squadron had established a supply landing ground several miles behind the lines, a flattened stretch of packed earth marked by oil drums and signal panels. Trucks moved continuously between the landing ground and the division supply area, carrying ammunition crates forward and empty fuel drums back. Captain Daniel Mercer was sent there under the authority of routine documentation verification. The order did not mention casualties. It instructed him to confirm transport utilization figures for the previous week. The field operations officer, a tired lieutenant who had not slept properly in 2 days, signed the access sheet without reading closely. Administrative inspections were common and usually brief. No one expected a medical officer to spend hours near the aircraft. The transports were C-47 cargo planes. Their engines were already warming in the cold morning air. Ground crews moved with practice speed, guiding trucks into position beneath the open fuselage doors. Wooden supply pallets were loaded in sequence according to a written manifest: rations, radio batteries, artillery fuses. Mercer did not begin with the aircraft. He started with the dispatch ledger inside the tent beside the runway. Every outgoing flight was recorded with cargo weight, destination, and estimated arrival time. The entries were orderly. A sergeant clerk maintained a log and corrected times with pencil when radios reported delays. Mercer asked a simple question: whether aircraft ever departed without cargo. The clerk answered immediately: no. Command policy did not permit empty flights unless repositioning between bases, and even then some material was usually assigned. Mercer then asked whether aircraft ever returned carrying personnel. The clerk hesitated before answering. He pointed toward a separate column near the margin of the pages. Occasionally, crews noted passengers, maintenance transfer, or courier. The entries were irregular and written by different hands. One entry from 3 days earlier listed no passengers but showed a landing weight higher than departure weight. The clerk explained it as fuel variation. Mercer copied the time and aircraft number. He waited beside the runway until that aircraft returned again late in the morning. The pilot climbed down after shutdown and removed his gloves slowly, looking more tired than the ground crews. First Lieutenant Harris had been flying transport routes since the invasion of North Africa. Before the war, he had been a commercial cargo pilot in the Midwest and had accumulated more flight hours than most of the squadron. He answered questions directly and without hostility because administrative officers rarely asked technical questions. Mercer asked about landing weight discrepancies. Harris paused before responding, considering whether the question was disciplinary or clerical. His tone remained neutral. Sometimes, he said, men were carried when roads were unsafe, not officially assigned and not recorded as cargo, usually one or two at a time. Soldiers who could sit upright. Mercer asked if they were wounded. Harris did not confirm immediately. He described them instead. Bandaged arms, occasionally stretchers secured against cargo straps, always accompanied by someone from a medical unit asking for temporary transport to surgical facilities. No written orders. The pilot's concern had not been regulation but balance. Additional weight required adjusting fuel margins. The distances were short enough to allow it. Mercer asked whether those men were alive upon arrival. Harris answered yes in every case he could remember. He added a detail without prompting. The men were quieter during flight than infantry passengers normally were. They did not speak much, but they remained conscious. Later that day, Mercer visited a rear medical clearing station 20 miles from the front. The station commander initially refused access to patient admission records, citing medical privacy and operational tempo. After Mercer produced written authority for statistical review, the commander allowed inspection under supervision. The admissions clerk located several recent cases marked as air delivered. The notation was informal and written beside the triage category. Mercer compared those patients' outcomes to others admitted in the same period. The difference appeared consistent, but not dramatic. Enough to notice, not enough to prove cause. He recorded times of injury, times of arrival, and vital condition upon intake. Most air-transported patients arrived alert. Ground convoy arrivals varied widely, even among similar wounds. The supervising doctor insisted this proved nothing. He explained that transport vibration, temperature, and prior treatment could not be standardized. Mercer agreed verbally and continued copying the figures. At dusk, he returned to the landing ground. A maintenance crew chief approached him without being asked. The chief had been informed an officer was asking about passenger loads and assumed a complaint was coming. He clarified that no crew had requested passengers. Requests always came from ground medical officers. Sometimes they insisted strongly because they believed the men would not survive road evacuation after dark. The chief also noted something else. Unofficial flights happened more often during periods of heavy shelling when ambulances avoided certain roads. When fighting quieted, requests stopped. Mercer realized the flights were not random favors, but responses to specific battlefield conditions. He wrote it down without comment. Before leaving, he requested the radio message log from the previous week. The operator provided carbon copies of short transmissions between aid stations and transport control. One repeated phrase appeared: road interdicted. The wording varied, but the meaning remained the same: evacuation delayed, alternate movement requested. Mercer placed the copies into his folder. None of them had been forwarded through medical command channels. As night approached, the aircraft prepared for another supply run. No passengers were visible during loading. Regulations were being followed, while observation was present. Mercer understood the limitation immediately. If the transports carried wounded, it occurred outside documentation, and the only trace remained in scattered notes across different departments that did not compare records. He returned toward headquarters without drafting conclusions. His task was still verification, but the records now formed a sequence: delay on the road, improvised flight, arrival in better condition. He had not determined the cause. He had determined the pattern existed beyond a single unit. Orders moved Mercer forward with the headquarters displacement toward the Tunisian high ground. The front had shifted into broken ridge lines where roads followed narrow valleys and could be observed from German artillery positions above. Vehicles moved only in short intervals between shelling. Medical evacuation slowed immediately. The new aid station operated inside a railway maintenance tunnel abandoned before the war. The entrance was reinforced with timber beams and sandbags. The interior smelled of oil, damp stone, and antiseptic. Stretchers were placed along the wall because there was no room for a separate delayed treatment section anymore. Every patient waited in the same line. Major Hale worked without raising his voice. He assigned plasma only when blood pressure dropped to a specific threshold because supply had to last through the night. No one spoke about survival probabilities. They spoke only about sequence. Who could wait, who could not. Ambulances arrived irregularly. One arrived after 20 minutes, another after nearly 3 hours. The drivers described artillery observers firing at predictable road curves. Several vehicles had turned back before reaching the forward companies. A battalion executive officer entered carrying a folded map marked with pencil lines. He explained that some wounded had been carried downhill by infantry because vehicles could not reach them. He requested authorization to move casualties at night only when observation lessened. Hale refused. Several men already showed late shock. Delaying further would not stabilize them. The decision passed to division command through field telephone. The reply returned slowly due to line interruptions. Ground evacuation remained the official method. Aircraft were not assigned because the landing ground lay beyond artillery range and could not approach closer safely. By afternoon, the number of untreated wounded exceeded available stretchers. The tunnel grew warmer and louder despite attempts to keep voices low. A young private repeatedly asked for water but was restricted due to abdominal injury risk. Hale explained the reason each time calmly, though the answer did not reduce the man's distress. Mercer documented arrival intervals and compared them with unit positions. Distance alone no longer explained the delays. Terrain observation did. The same unit could evacuate quickly at 1 hour and not at another depending on enemy fire direction. Near sunset, a signal operator delivered a message from a forward company for casualties unable to be moved before darkness, requesting alternative evacuation. The message moved up the chain through multiple officers. Each repeated the same concern. Aircraft landing forward would expose pilots and divert supply flights scheduled for ammunition delivery at dawn. A staff conference occurred inside a small command shelter. The logistics officer opposed the request. He calculated that losing even one transport would reduce artillery resupply for the next day's attack. The infantry representative argued that several men would not survive the night without movement. Neither officer raised his voice. Both spoke as though describing inventory. The commanding general approved a single trial under restrictive conditions. One aircraft at first light, landing only if ground signal panels confirmed safety. The landing ground chosen was not a prepared strip, but a widened section of dry riverbed marked by engineers using white fabric panels weighted with stones. The engineers measured distance by pacing because proper surveying equipment was unavailable forward. Before dawn the next morning, soldiers cleared loose rocks by hand. A medical detachment waited beside the marked zone with 4 stretcher patients. Hale supervised personally. He checked each tag again before transport, recording pulse and responsiveness so changes during movement could be tracked later. The aircraft approached low between ridges, visible only seconds before touchdown. The landing was rough but controlled. The flight nurse and technician exited immediately and secured stretchers to the interior brackets installed for cargo restraint. No additional treatment occurred beyond securing bandages and monitoring breathing. There was no equipment for surgery and little room for movement once loaded. The aircraft departed within minutes to reduce exposure. After takeoff, the valley became quiet again, except for artillery farther along the line. The waiting personnel did not discuss success or failure because the outcome was unknown until arrival reports returned. Several hours later, a radio message confirmed delivery to a rear surgical hospital. All 4 patients were alive upon admission. Mercer recorded the times precisely but added no interpretation. The event remained a single occurrence under exceptional conditions. By evening, more requests arrived from other companies observing the same road closures. Command did not yet approve further flights. The question had shifted from possibility to control, whether such evacuations could be coordinated without interfering with combat operations. No answer was given that day. Within days, additional evacuation requests began arriving through separate channels rather than a single command route. Infantry companies reported wounded awaiting movement. Engineers reported improvised landing areas prepared but unused, and Transport Control reported aircraft availability limited by scheduled supply commitments. None of the reports matched in quantity or timing. Division headquarters ordered that every casualty movement be logged through a unified reporting form. The order was simple but difficult to execute because 3 radio networks operated independently: tactical, engineering, and air transport, each using its own message format. Mercer was assigned to reconcile the figures. He moved between signal tents, collecting carbon copies of transmissions before they were discarded. The messages were brief and written under pressure: grid coordinates, number of wounded, urgency classification. Many lacked confirmation that the message had even been received. At the rear surgical hospital, he inspected admission logs again. The staff there had begun noting arrival method more carefully after repeated inquiries. Some patients listed as air transport had no corresponding request recorded at the front. Others expected by air never arrived and appeared later by truck. The discrepancy suggested either unauthorized flights or inaccurate reporting. The hospital commander assumed clerical delay and instructed Mercer to ignore incomplete entries. Mercer did not argue, but continued comparing timestamps. One afternoon, an aircraft landed carrying 2 patients whose names appeared nowhere in forward medical records. The flight nurse handed over handwritten tags prepared during loading because original tags had been lost during movement downhill. The injuries were moderate. Both men remained conscious. Mercer traced their unit through personnel rosters and located the company medic who had sent them. The medic explained that he had transmitted a request, but received no reply and assumed the message failed. Hours later, an aircraft arrived unexpectedly after receiving a different unit's request for the same grid reference, which had been reused after a map correction. The landing zone designation system used overlapping map sheets. Coordinates that appeared distinct on one grid matched another several kilometers away on a different reference. Engineers marked a site for one unit, while aircraft navigated using another grid version. Some flights therefore reached the wrong wounded, not by error in flying, but by error in map interpretation. Mercer confirmed this by overlaying the map additions inside the operations tent. The grid shift was small enough to avoid suspicion, yet large enough to separate companies by terrain barriers. Reports of aircraft failing to find casualties were not failures of navigation, but failures of shared reference. He documented each mismatched coordinate and presented them to the operations officer. The officer immediately ordered revised signal panels, colored combinations assigned to specific regiments to confirm identity before landing. Radio confirmation alone was no longer considered sufficient. During the next evacuation attempt, the aircraft circled once before landing, waiting for the correct color arrangement to appear. The delay cost several minutes, but prevented landing at the wrong location. The wounded were loaded without confusion. Later, reviewing the compiled figures, Mercer found another inconsistency. Several men listed as deceased at forward stations appeared in rear hospital recovery reports. The explanation came from duplicated casualty transmissions sent during heavy interference. A unit that believed its first message failed repeated it, and headquarters recorded both as separate individuals. Supply allocations based on those reports had diverted plasma to empty positions, while actual stations improvised treatment using reduced quantities. The problem had not been lack of material, but inaccurate distribution caused by communication overlap. Corrective procedure followed. Only acknowledged messages would generate supply movement, and casualty reports required confirmation codes before entry into operational totals. The records began aligning for the first time. Arrival counts matched departure requests, and landing zones corresponded to actual units. Aircraft losses remained zero during these carefully coordinated flights, reducing command resistance. Mercer closed the day's ledger with figures that no longer contradicted each other. The investigation had shifted from questioning individual decisions to correcting the structure that carried information between them. As the line advanced beyond the ridges into open valleys, the tempo of operations increased and armored units prepared for a coordinated push toward the next defensive belt. Supply requirements rose immediately. Fuel and artillery ammunition became the priority cargo for every available transport aircraft. Evacuation requests did not decrease. They multiplied. Division headquarters transferred authority over aircraft assignment to corps level to prevent local competition for limited flights. The decision centralized control but removed direct coordination between medical officers and air crews. All requests now passed through a scheduling desk staffed by operations officers rather than medical personnel. Mercer was ordered to attach temporarily to Corps headquarters to continue statistical reconciliation. The headquarters occupied a former administrative complex reinforced with sandbagged corridors and blackout curtains. Inside, the scheduling room contained a wall chart listing aircraft numbers, departure times, and cargo categories written in grease pencil. Medical evacuation appeared only as an optional annotation beside certain flights. The Corps Operations Officer, Colonel Everett Shaw, had commanded artillery logistics before the war and approached aircraft allocation as a matter of tonnage efficiency. His position was clear. A transport aircraft carrying ammunition contributed directly to combat power. A transport carrying wounded did not affect the immediate outcome of an engagement. He approved evacuation flights only when in used cargo space remained. Mercer reviewed recent casualty outcomes from sectors under Shaw's control and compared them to divisions still coordinating locally with air crews. The numbers differed sharply over identical time periods. He presented the figures in a short written memorandum without interpretation. Shaw read it in silence and returned it with a single comment written across the bottom. Correlation is not operational proof. The next offensive began 2 days later. Armored units advanced faster than expected and outran established ground evacuation routes. Forward aid stations filled quickly, and requests for aircraft transport increased throughout the day. Shaw limited flights to scheduled supply returns only. By evening, multiple units reported men remaining untreated beyond the planned evacuation interval. Hale, now operating from a mobile surgical truck near the forward elements, transmitted repeated condition updates, noting deterioration after prolonged waiting periods. His messages remained factual and avoided recommendations. At midnight, Corps headquarters received a consolidated casualty report showing a higher proportion of deaths occurring after arrival at surgical facilities rather than at the point of injury. The staff duty officer requested verification before forwarding it upward because the pattern contradicted standard assumptions about battlefield lethality. Mercer confirmed the timestamps personally using hospital admissions and field reports matched through the new confirmation codes. The sequence remained consistent across separate units. The information was presented during the morning operations briefing. No argument followed. Shaw ordered a temporary exception allowing designated evacuation flights during daylight between scheduled supply runs, limited to specific sectors with blocked road movement. The first aircraft under the revised authorization departed within the hour, carrying 4 stretcher patients and 2 seated wounded. The flight returned later with confirmation of survival upon transfer. Shaw did not comment on the result. He marked the flight on the wall chart and adjusted the next day's schedule to include a fixed evacuation interval regardless of cargo availability. Mercer recorded the change as an operational variable rather than a conclusion. The decision altered procedure but did not yet establish doctrine. The command treated it as a controlled measure subject to continuation only if it did not reduce offensive capability. The revised flight intervals continued for several weeks as the advance moved toward the coastal plains. The front stabilized enough for records to accumulate under consistent conditions. Aircraft departed at scheduled times regardless of cargo shortages, and evacuation requests followed standardized confirmation procedures. For the first time, transport, medical, and operational logs described the same sequence of events. Mercer remained at Corps headquarters compiling daily summaries. He no longer searched for isolated incidents, but for sustained patterns over distance and time. Each entry included hour of injury, hour of arrival at surgical care, method of transport, and physiological condition upon admission. He avoided qualitative language and recorded only measurable states: conscious or unconscious, stable or unstable pulse, presence or absence of shock. Major Hale submitted parallel medical notes from the forward surgical teams. His record showed that treatment methods had not changed. The same plasma quantities, the same triage rules, and the same surgical techniques were used throughout the period. Only arrival timing varied. After 10 days, the compiled figures formed a continuous dataset rather than separate reports. Mercer calculated survival proportions by transport interval rather than by unit or terrain. The difference remained consistent across multiple engagements and weather conditions. The findings were forwarded to higher headquarters as an operational analysis rather than a recommendation. The document described a relationship between elapsed evacuation time and condition at surgical intake without attributing cause beyond observation. Corps Command requested verification from rear hospitals to confirm that survival continued beyond initial admission. Recovery wards provided follow-up outcomes indicating that patients arriving earlier not only survived surgery more frequently, but required fewer secondary procedures. A formal review board assembled inside the headquarters conference room. Present were operations officers, medical officers, transport representatives, and administrative staff. No one argued about individual cases. They examined tables of numbers prepared from independently maintained records that now matched across departments. Colonel Shaw read the summary silently before asking whether any entry depended on unauthorized action. Mercer confirmed that all data used standardized reporting codes introduced earlier. Hale confirmed no alteration in treatment protocol during the measured period. The board recorded the results as an operational efficiency finding rather than a medical theory. A directive was issued assigning scheduled evacuation capacity as a standing requirement within transport planning calculations. The wording avoided reference to compassion or morale. It referred only to preservation of trained personnel. The directive required signatures from command staff to acknowledge implementation. Shaw signed without comment and instructed scheduling officers to incorporate the requirement permanently into planning charts. Mercer filed the final report with attached appendices of corrected message procedures, landing signal standards, and admission recording format. No individual error remained under review because discrepancies have been traced to system design rather than personal neglect. That evening, aircraft departed under routine orders carrying both supplies and wounded according to the same timetable. The flights no longer required special authorization. Personnel at the landing ground treated the procedure as ordinary duty. Mercer closed his ledger after confirming the last entry aligned with hospital admission time. The investigation ended not with an announcement, but with the absence of further conflicting records.